Elias had counted his breaths for as long as he could remember. Out here, the desert kept a steady, indifferent rhythm. A furnace wind, the whisper of grit, the long, slow inhalation of heat that made the horizon waver like a mirage. He had been counting because numbers were a kind of prayer, small, steady rituals that kept panic at bay. They were simpler than faith and more honest. 5 steps to the rusted cart, 7 to the tarp, 12 to the sunshade that once belonged to someone who called this place home. The man with the ragged shirt and the salt-stiff hair had one thought that repeated in a monotone chorus. Water. Water, water. When he reached the makeshift outpost, a hulking contraption on stilts. Its belly pocked with vents and solar plates. His legs gave up for a second and everything tilted. He steadied himself with a hand on the metal rim of the hatch and looked up, because it was easier to keep looking outward than to meet his own reflection in an empty water can. The outpost had been half buried by sand in places, its fans jammed with grit, but the panels across its roof still shone like a promise. Someone had left the hatch ajar. Inside, the dim light smelled of old oil and colder things. Control panels blinked and hummed like bored insects. A row of tiny, stubborn LEDs blinked under a strip of plexiglass. Elias thought of the last time the LEDs had given him hope. He thought of his brother's laugh, of the way water tasted in a dream, and then the memory buckled because pain flared under his ribs, where a shard of metal had cut him earlier in the day. He winced and felt dampness blossom on his shirt. He had not expected company. She moved like a rising tide. She filled the doorway like an oncoming weather front. Taller than any human by at least a head and a half, skin the color of deep ocean twilight, and hair that tangled like kelp and hung with dust. Her limbs were long and lithe. Veins of pale bioluminescence threaded her skin and pulsed slowly with each breath. Her eyes, large, golden, and uncannily liquid, fixed on him, arresting and curious. The hand that reached toward him from the doorway had slender fingers tipped with calloused pads, not claws. She was not monstrous. She was impossibly a creature of waves and deep cave light who had found herself in an old metal box in the middle of a sun-baked plain. Elias stared until his vision blurred. His breath came shallow and hot. For a moment, something like laughter trembled in the woman's throat, a sound that might have been a language or a melody. Her head tilted, studying, mapping. Then she spoke, and the sound was a cascade of syllables that rode the metal air like wind across a bottle. It meant nothing to his ears, but she switched quickly to gestures, and then, with a gentle roll of light from her neck, she produced a small device that stitched itself into the air between them. A translator, cobbled from alien tech and the old hub's software, which spun an approximate human tone. "You are hurt," the device said in a grainy voice. It was not perfect, but intent carried further than vowels. Elias found his jaw working. He swallowed. "You speak." She cocked her head in a way that made the translator render the sound as a soft exhalation. "I am called Aaron," it said. "My vessel compromised. I require." The word for water did not come through at once, but Aaron made a cupping motion, eyes softening, and the device computed, stumbling, liquid sustenance. Elias realized then that whatever the translator did not catch, it could not hide. The alien's eyes were brimming with the same raw, common thing he carried in his chest, need. He lowered the empty can to the deck and watched as she came fully out of the hatch. Where the metal floor met her solace, small whirls of dust swept away in little eddies, as if moved by her breath. "First," she insisted through the speaker, and reached out. Her fingers brushed his chest with a coolness that felt like a promise. There was no compassion in the way people sometimes displayed it. Aaron's touch was an assessment, a probe that searched for injury and stanching. Then something glowed under her palm, a filigree of light, thin as thread, and for a wild second Elias thought of stars. The pain eased. The bleeding slowed. Aaron's mouth worked, making a sound the translator rendered as a low hum, and the light faded into a pale scab over his collarbone. Elias made a sound that could have been gratitude or a sob. How? Symbiosis, the device said, and Aaron's gaze softened. I heal with light. The light trades with harm. I do this to survive. Whether she meant for herself or for others, Elias didn't know. He only knew the immediate fact. He did not feel as faint. The desert's appetite didn't look so inevitable. He dragged his eyes away from Aaron's face and looked at the outpost, an old life support module slapped together by someone with more hope than resources. A basin, a small dented sink, bulged with sediment in one corner. 2 containers were mounted behind the control board. One was marked in faded human script. The other bore a set of marks that Aaron's translator labeled as recyclers. Elias thought of his water can. It was empty. He thought of the wide stretch of blazing sand outside and the sun's hunger. He had survived by stealing, by bargaining, by the delicate criminality of scavenging. He had never run into anything like Aaron. Why are you here? He asked. The attempt at casualness sounded like a confession. Aaron watched the ceiling as if the metal held a memory. The translator picked up a word, then another. Shipfall. Crew lost. I am last of it tripped. The device offered a human approximation. Aerial colony, the Silver Shoal, I was scouting when. Elias had heard ragged cargo whispers about crashers and wayfarers in the authoritarian towns of the Rim. About alien relics that washed ashore like flotsam. He had not believed that such legends would become his reality, not when he had grown up learning to see the sky as a liar. But Aaron's shoulders tightened, and he could read the rest without the translation. She needed to repair her vessel, or to find a new way off this planet. She needed water to fuel the biocore of her suit, and to keep her skin from desiccating like a reef pulled from the ocean. I can get water, Elias said. The words were small, but they held the old defiant spark. I know where there are a couple of stills, buried but intact. I can walk you to them. Aaron's skin pulsed a blink of cobalt. The translator said, gratitude expressed. A more primal reaction, something older than language, rippled through her face. She nodded. They were an odd pair set against a planet that was determined to forget them both. He sun-scarred and bent by 1,000 small defeats. She, lithe and ancient in the slow rhythm of ocean lives, her body still marveling at the raw, dry air. It occurred to Elias that perhaps the universe knew the shape of irony. 2 creatures from different orbits, leaning on each other in a washed-out nowhere. Elias hoisted his can with the wrong hand and led Aaron down from the hatch. When the sky hit them, the light spilled and turned Aaron's skin into a living tapestry. Dust clung to her hair and made little halos around the luminous veins running along her arms. She moved with slow curiosity, fingers trailing over the corroded fans as if learning their memory. What's your name? Aaron asked at one point, and the translator rendered the single syllable like a pebble dropped into a bowl. Elias, he said. Elias Mar. A name like stone, the translator commented. It sounded like praise. They started on a path that led to a sunken well Elias had known since childhood, a dent in the earth, where old pipes had been buried a long time ago. He had kept it secret. Its roof had been camouflaged with salvaged panels. The stills it fed were small, stubborn things. They siphoned fog at dawn into a chamber, condensed it against a ceramic coil. It took patience and the kind of reverence that made thieves into caretakers. Elias had stolen from towns and then come back to nurse the stills with oil and glove work because he believed, superstitiously, that not everything had to be taken as they walked. A fear that had no name walked beside Elias like a shadow. Bandits roamed these parts, scavengers who had decided pain was something to be inflicted, not endured. The desert, for all its honest cruelty, had bred crueler things. He kept his hand near the old knife at his hip. They reached the first, still in an hour. Dawn had not yet learned its shades, but the sky was already working on a palette of pale golds. Erin bent, delicate as a tide pooling, and placed her palms on the metal coil. The translator sang a single mournful note. "This technology is familiar." "It was refurbished," Elias said. "Acker did it. He left for the South 2 years ago." The memory of Acker, a friend who'd traded parts for laughter, tasted like copper. "If the condenser hasn't been scalded by heat, we might get a leader." Erin closed her eyes. Light strobed along the pattern in her skin like a biosignal checking in with an old friend. When she opened them, her pupils were flecked with sudden, infinite tenderness. She tapped a sequence on Elias's wrist, a crude navigation mark, and the translator hummed, decoding intention. "You will come with me? I can return the favor." There was an expectation behind the offer. Erin had the ability to restore, to heal, to resolder living flesh with a touch. If she had been trusted, if she had been welcomed, she would be a community's miracle. The outpost in the distance, the rusted hatch from which she had emerged, might have been that miracle's beginning. Elias thought of his bleeding chest and the scab of light still faint under his collarbone. The memory of pain softened. They worked until the sun had pulled itself above the horizon like a coin. Frost forms of condensed vapor collected around the coil and plinked into the can. It was not much, 2 liters at best, but water tasted like an absolution they had both been waiting for. Erin drank the way a creature returned to a lost ocean, drinks, deeply, with small gasps that the translator translated into the words, "life again." Elias watched her. When she finished, she cupped her hands around his wounds and let her light weave through the torn skin. It felt strange and sacred, like watching a small miracle. The scar would mark him for a while, he knew, but the pain dulled to a reminder and not a sentence. "Why did your ship fall?" Elias asked when they rested. Erin's voice through the machine slowed. "Anomalous decay in the core," it said. "We were caught in a rain of glass, micrometeorites. The hull breached. Propulsion lost. Crew scattered across the wastes. I was separated." Her shoulders rounded. Even through the technological cloak, the translation allowed a flicker of grief. Elias imagined a silver hull, whole and alive, cleaving the sky. He could not imagine Erin's voice in the engine room, the chorus of an entire crew. Grief sounded different in alien timbres. He thought of his own losses, not a crashed colony, but a village left behind, a woman he had loved once and lost to fever. Loss made everyone age. "Do you want help finding them?" he asked. Erin's glow brightened the slightest degree. "Yes, if any remain." They lingered in that hope like people clinging to a lamp in an industry of night. Then the sound came, not the easy wind, but distant and deliberate. Engines tuned for scrounge, the irregular beat of a convoy. Elias's skin puckered. The bandits moved in groups, sometimes as a caravan, sometimes as hands reaching for any living thing. Erin's head snapped up. Her eyes became knives. "We must hide," she said. The translator rendered the words with exact, businesslike tones, but the urgency marched through like a drum. They moved to the sun-stilled shadows of an old dune, the outpost a square on the horizon. Elias could see figures moving in the distance. A cloud of dust lifted and then resolved into shapes. 3 rusted skiffs, patched sails and engines. Riders sat hunched like vultures, their silhouettes carrying rifles and scavenged armor. They were close. Elias wanted to flee. He wanted to carry Erin to the stills and then run till the world forgot his name. But the bandits did not pass the outpost by accident. Scavengers with maps had learned the places water lingered. They were not searching for a man with an empty can. They were searching for a salvageable instance of anything that functioned. Power cores, oxygen tanks. A living body was just another container if it could be sold. Erin's skin dimmed as if to ink. She made a movement, short and swift. and the translator said, "I can cloak." Elias's head spun. Cloak, like a myth. She had the ability to dim her bioluminescence, to coat her skin with a reflective sheen that tasted like air. She folded herself into the dune and became, somehow, less. Elias followed because his legs finally remembered the shape of sprinting. Together they melted into the land. The bandits passed with slow, cruel curiosity. One of them, a man with a gas mask and an iron smile, dismounted and circled the outpost, kicking at doors and looking for anything that could be repurposed. The convoy's leader sniffed the air like a dog, relishing the scent of habitation, and the other two fanned out on errand hunts. For a long hour they were a presence, a threat that rode the sky. And then they pulled away on the same geographies of desire that had carried them here. When the last engine thinned to a memory, Aaron uncoiled like a rising wave. "They smelled the outpost," she said. "There may be others." Elias's throat cracked. "Others?" "Predators," the translator said. "They are attracted to functioning systems. They will return if there is energy here." He had known this word for a long time. Energy whisperers always came back. The outpost's little Elise could be heard by a net of thieves like honey draws flies. "Can you fix your ship?" Elias asked. Aaron's shoulders lifted. "I can attempt repairs. The core is broken. I can create a patch, but I need a power source for the sequence, and a specific conductor alloy we've not found here." The alloy was a mythical thing. It might be in an old refinery in the south, a place where the metal of 1,000 reliquaries had been repurposed into the tools of survival. People said the refinery was guarded. Others said it had become a ruin. Elias had a plan that began with a name. "Acker," he said. "He used to trade with the refinery. He knows the supply routes. If he's still alive, he might have parts." Aaron's eyes went soft. "Where is he?" "He left a message once," Elias said. "In this outpost. Before the wheel of the world broke. I always thought he would come back." They returned to the outpost in the silver hour, when the day was losing heat and the desert seemed to remember that there was such a thing as cold. Inside, the hatches smelled of oil and the faint tang of old ammonia. Elias rummaged behind panels, under wiring harnesses, and finally found a small metal cubby with a scrap of paper pinned under a bolt. Acker's handwriting was a child's scratch. A map scrawled in shorthand, south to the refinery, then east to a mark that meant water, and a note, 3 words, that read, in looped letters, "Trust the tide." "Trust the tide," Aaron repeated. The phrase made her glow in a new way, like a hymn. It is an idiom. It suggests faith in movement. Elias laughed once, a small thin sound that tasted like ash. Acker believed the tracks of the world ran like tides. He thought everything came back around. They set out toward the south before dawn. Their bargain was simple. Aaron would help Elias reach the refinery, and Elias would help her salvage a conductor. They traveled through a world that had been slowly unstitched. Carcasses of ancient machines lay half-buried like whale bones. Aaron tapped the ground and listened, not with ears, but with a vibration sense that Elias could only guess at. She sang sometimes, a low vibration that made the dust stand up in little rings, and it felt like the song of someone whose language was older than metal. They shared stories in the small breaks of the day. Elias told Aaron about his mother and the old town that had been a harbor of its own tragedies, about the small ways people tried to be kind in a place that taught them to hoard. Aaron told him about the Silver Shoal, about long corridors lit with the bio-blue of her people's veins, about festivals where creatures braided light into their hair. Her stories were not like his. They unfolded sideways, full of aquatic metaphors and currents that made Elias dizzy. But he listened the way a man drinks after being thirsty for months, hungrily, with an attention that made the telling sacred. When the refinery rose on the horizon, it looked like a skeleton of a city. Towers that had once belched smoke now housed flocks of scavenger birds that nested in catwalks. The place had been claimed by silence and rust, but where there is rust, there is also salvage. Elias's steps grew lighter with the thought of metal, of barter, and of Aaron's promised repair. Maybe, they could both leave this planet. The refinery gates were guarded by a patchwork of wire and signs. Acker's map led them through a narrow service lane where the shade still kept things cool. There were people moving in the shadows, trading in the heaps. Elias recognized the man at the center of one ring. Acker, older, with a missing tooth and hands like old grinders. He might have been a ghost if not for his laugh. "Acker," Elias called, and the man looked up as if he had been mid-mechanic prayer. His face opened with something like recognition and then a slow, cautious smile. "Elias," Acker said. "By the sun, boy. You've been a hard spirit to track." Aaron stepped forward. Her skin pulsed a greeting, and Acker's eyes widened. Elias introduced them, and Acker's hand, big, oil-stained, reached out to touch the alien's arm, as if confirming that the world had not yet gone mad. "I have what you need," Acker said later in the dim of his shop. A crate of alloys stacked like teeth behind him. "But they don't come cheap. I trade in favors now. The refinery is full of trouble. There are people who don't like me taking stock." Elias felt the old fear crawl up his spine. "What will you take?" Acker leaned forward, his pipe-scented breath folding into categories. "You owe me some work. There's a corroded turbine on the east deck, a bloody thing that's about to fall. Fix it for me, and the conductor's yours." The bargain fit the old economy of survival. Something for something, and not necessarily in fair measure. Elias rolled his shoulders and felt the light scab under his collarbone. Aaron watched the men with a kind of ocean-deep assessment. She made a small motion, and the translator put into words, "I will assist." They worked until the refinery's sky bled into sunset, and the turbine, old as regret, roared back into a kind of life under their hands. Aaron's fingers, infused with that strange light, coaxed brittle seals to give way and old gears to remember their angles. Acker looked on, half wonder and half trade. And when the turbine spun, he clapped his hands like a man at church. The conductor, a strip of alloy that bent like a living thing, silver blue and humming, was handed over with a grunt. Aaron accepted it as if she named a lost child. She tucked it into a satchel and pressed a small token into Elias's palm, a shard of the hull from her ship, warm and vibrating at the edges. "You will need this in repairs," she said. "It carries a memory. It will speak to the hull." Elias took it like someone accepting a promise. They returned to the outpost with the alloy stitched into a plan, and Acker's pipe smoke a trailing laugh behind them. The bandits had not returned yet, but the world hummed with the knowledge of things that might come. Aaron worked with a focus that made her seem like a surgeon moving through wood. She fitted the conductor into the small core of her damaged suit, soldering with hands that had once been used to listen to currents. The translator ran diagnostics that blinked with success. The outpost's old power banks wheezed and gave a little. When Aaron's suit sealed and her core spun, the air inside the hatch felt like an atmosphere shifting, the taste of saline, the smell of warm metal. Tears, not human but something close, slid down Aaron's cheeks and caught in the light. "You leave?" Elias asked. "For now," she said. The translator rendered the words like a vow. "The Silver Shoal may be beyond repair. I will seek survivors. If I find them, I will return." Elias thought of companionship and of leaving this desert behind. He thought of the taste of water and of the trade he had made. He thought of Acker and the refinery, and how people could bind themselves back together with the smallest of tools. At the hatch, Aaron turned. Her hand brushed Elias's shoulder, not a touch of romance but a steadying human thing. "You saved me," she said to the translator. I cannot repay you in coin. But I can give you. She placed a small sliver from her ship into his hand, not the conductor, but a pale, translucent shard that held within it a wavering pattern like tides. If ever you wish to leave, she said, present this at the starways. They will tell you what a ship owes you. Elias laughed, an incredulous sound. The starways won't take me. Aaron's eyes were a soft, steady tide. Maybe you don't wish to go, she said. Maybe you will find something here. He watched her climb into the hatch, small against the vastness of her vessel, now functional in some part, her frame lit by the touch of her own core. She looked back a single time. Elias Mar, she said. Stay alive. Then she was gone. The outpost hummed. The fans turned, slow and steady. The desert sighed with a wind that tasted of salt and new beginnings. Elias stood at the hatch and watched the figure of Aaron shrink until she was a dot and then a shimmer swallowed by the horizon. He turned his head and let the wind fill his lungs. The scab of light on his chest tickled like a secret. He knew the desert had not changed. It would still be indifferent and hungry, and bandits still prowled like hungry things. But the world had shifted in small, stubborn ways. There were messages now in his pocket, a shard and a memory, and an agreement with a creature whose skin carried the light of tides. Elias walked back into the outpost. He opened a drawer and placed Aaron's shard on the table like an offering. He sat down and began to write, because if the world wanted to remember anyone at all, perhaps it would remember their names. He wrote what he could, a map of the stills, the route to the refinery. The day a blue woman had stepped out of a hatch and offered him saline and song. Outside. The wind kept counting the days in a language he did not know. Inside, beneath the hum of reclaimed electricity, Elias counted his breaths again. They were fewer that night, because for the first time in a long while, he felt the number of them as currency he could spend rather than debt he had to pay. When the stars came out, thin and indifferent and cold, he lay back and let the night hold him. He thought of tides and of ships and of the peculiar gravity that made strangers into companions. The shard inside the drawer pulsed once, a soft internal echo. Somewhere, far away and above the sky he could see, Aaron's ship sang a tune that a hull had taught it. Elias dreamed, for the first time in a very long time, of oceans,